Welcome everyone to this panel session discussion with Christopher Brett, where I'm glad you can join us this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you are. We have an exciting discussion lined up. And, to introduce Christopher Brett, he's the lead agricultural specialist of the World Bank. Has over 30 years of experience in the public sector, in the private sector, doing development work, and really across the world. He's done stuff in Africa, he's worked in Latin America, he's done work in Asia. So has a very good perspective of different issues impacting agriculture and agribusiness, across different sectors and across different regions. He's been at the World Bank now for, roughly 4 years, since 2016. Prior to that was with Olam for 9 years as the global head of corporate responsibility. He's done in-depth consulting work with DFID and other organizations on agricultural policy work and implementation work across the world. And one particular thing that I found quite interesting is that he also has a very informed perspective about Nigeria as well, because he lived and worked in Nigeria for quite a few years in the 1980s and probably traveled around to many cities and towns that some of us haven't been to. He's lived and worked in Yola in northeastern Nigeria, and also in Eket in the south of Nigeria. So very good perspective, both globally and also honing down into specifics from the Nigeria context. So Chris, very glad to have you here with us. And in terms of the format for our conversation, Chris will give us a presentation and to set the stage, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards, and then open up to questions from the audience. So Chris, welcome, and thank you for being here, and I'll hand over to you.
No, thank you very much. And obviously my sincere congratulations on that 10-year milestone. The first 10 years, I would like to say, is the hardest. You're now set up, you're established, and I wish you tremendous success going forward. And I really do thank you for the opportunity of joining this important occasion and sharing this global perspective. But just to also share is, I so wish I was with you in person. I mean, Nigeria is my second home. I lived there for 10 years. I met my wife in Nigeria. She was a person who came to visit, and then we met. So we have very, very strong relationships with Nigeria, and I frequently visit. So I hope hopefully to come and visit you soon and see some of the projects and investments that you're invested in. So let's really drill down on this. I'm going to share my screen and go into a presentation mode. Hope all the technology is working. We're live from my study in Washington, so of all places. So I'm going to start the presentation now, and I'll be talking it through. So thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm sitting in the World Bank, the Agriculture and Food Global Practice. I want to sort of stress to the audience that the World Bank is a group. We're a group which covers all of these areas you're looking at, the government as well as the private sector. And I think this is really important, for the audience to understand how this World Bank group operates. I'm sitting in the World Bank side. So I'm in this side where my clients are the governments, the governments across the world. And we also have the IFC and the MEGA, whose clients are the private sector. I think this is important to really see, is the way the World Bank Group brings so much opportunity of bringing this public-private sector debate together. We all have a huge amount at stake here. What the governments do to enable the private sector to operate, and how the private sector can invest, operate, create wealth, create jobs, create inclusion, create opportunities across these important spaces. Obviously, in this conversation, I'm going to be focusing very much on the agribusiness agenda, which is looking at the agricultural production, the inputs, all the way through processing, across the logistics, and then to the food systems as well. I think just to get sort of things in perspective, where we are in the World Bank in the Agriculture and Food Global Practice, our portfolio is at present just over $20 billion of investments across the world, of which a large percentage is across Africa. And also to consider that Nigeria is a very, very large and important client to the World Bank that we can talk about as well. So this is important to acknowledge. The other thing to realize is that every year in the agriculture and food global practice, we actually loan about $3 to $4 billion per year to governments. And around that lending, we also do a tremendous amount of capacity building. We do a tremendous amount of analytical work to be able to show and advise governments where these investments should be targeted. And when we look at this slide, we're seeing IBRD and we're seeing IDA. IDA is the International Development Assistance, and this is really applicable to low-income countries, which is very much obviously relevant to Africa, as well as parts of Asia and so on. But the middle-income countries also have a vast importance to us, and those countries are where we also do loans. Now, the loan rates are different between IBRD and IDA, and I think that's important to understand as well. So this gives you a context of us as a group. We're a group of about 16,000 employees across the world, which sounds like a large number, but within the agricultural space, we're about 240 full-time staff across the world, as well as got a lot of consultancy support and so on around us. So really getting into this conversation, this is really where the World Bank Group is looking at the vision for the food system. And the food system, I'm going to be really brutal, it's broken. It's not functioning, it's not fit for purpose. And I really want to explain that as we go through this presentation. We're looking for a healthy economy. We're looking for healthy people. We're looking for a healthy planet. These are the kind of areas that's really driving our strategic vision, the vision that we share and promote with our clients, both the public and the private sector. We've put a lot of analytics, a lot of support, and I was listening to earlier conversations, and I hear the World Bank numbers constantly being referred to. Dr. Rajiv Shah talked about the move backwards of people going into more poverty because of COVID, and I'll be touching on that as well. So here, I want to really stress that, the healthy economy is really about inclusive incomes. It's about jobs and livelihoods. We want to see a society which is growing with equality. Inequality leads to many, many issues of discontent and issues of other problems as well. So a lot of issues here we have to look at. We have to look at this huge growth of urbanization. When I lived in Nigeria, the population was around about 75 million. That population has more than doubled over the last 25 years and rapidly increasing. We're seeing the megacity complexes, around the state of Lagos is now huge with over 20 million people. So we're looking at, how do we create jobs? How do we support structural transformation on achieving a lot of areas around the economy? And really, the 2030 end poverty target, quite frankly, is unlikely to be met. We look at significant lag in what we call FCVs. FC is fragile conflict violence states. There is a huge issue around this space, and the World Bank, I can say with great pride, is a real first mover in a lot of these conflict and violence states. We support and strengthen governments and engage with communities when they need it most, and I think that's really critical. We have to look at healthy people. There's secure and food, safe food and nutrition. There is a lot of unsafe food out there. There is a lot of food which is having really negative health implications. We have to end hunger. You can see the kind of numbers on this slide. We have to look at how we are looking at the issues of stunting, micronutrient deficiency, the amount of people who are overweight. There's been an increase in zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases is the transfer of diseases from animals to humans. This is something we're doing an awful lot of work at the present. We're very, very concerned where a lot of diseases, pandemics like COVID and stuff, is originating out of the animal sector and transferring to human. This is another area we're looking at. The other area of concern is the real resistance coming to antibiotics, which we call the antimicrobial resistance syndrome, that we're also looking at. The areas of healthy planet, this environment, sustainable practices. In my experience, this word sustainability has been stretched and pulled and it's gone all over the place. But we've really got to define what it means to work within planetary boundaries. We must be living within what the planet can offer us. And this is looking at land degradation, water scarcity, pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, and also the high loss of food, the high loss and waste of food, etc. 25% of global emissions is coming from the agricultural sector, a critical number to consider. Now, when I said the system here is not fit for purpose, the food system, this really is trying to explain to you that we have a market value of a global food system around about $10 trillion. But the hidden costs of that is around about 12 trillion. Now, this is something to really look at. The obesity, the undernutrition, the pollution, the antimicrobial resistance, the greenhouse gas emissions, natural capital costs, rural welfare issues, the food loss and waste and fertilizer leakages, all of these elements across the health, the environment, and the economic considerations or issues that the World Bank Group looks at is building this whole number up of where we have a huge amount of hidden costs, which we have to look at in detail and start fixing and changing and transforming. This is a very powerful message, and this comes out of what we call the FOLU report of 2019, F-O-L-U. Please search that on the internet, have a look at it, and it gives tremendous amount of detail on how we have to transform our systems. This isn't just applicable to emerging economies, it's also very applicable to emerged economies as well. Looking at the crisis that we're facing now, I mean, I really, really want to express, my concern and my real heartfelt losses that many of us have had over this year related to COVID. Africa has been hit by COVID. I mean, I can say thankfully not as bad as other countries in terms of numbers, but it's had huge associated impacts on the issues across the food system. It's also it's led to really showing where the weakened value chains are and the issues of food loss and waste. Malnutrition, which has really weakened immune systems, has led to an increased occurrence of COVID as well across the world. So we're looking at really food systems which have got to offer much better nutrition and value to the human well-being to actually reduce the incidence, not just of COVID, but disease in general. The other thing we're very, very saddened to see is that in Africa, we've had this huge locust outbreak across the southeast part of Africa, which is also extended into the Middle East as well. So the locust outbreak has brought huge hardship as well to many of the countries that, obviously you're associated with and we operate in. We share a lot of these issues as well. But also at the same time, the pandemic has led to a lot of milk that had to be dumped in emerging economies. It couldn't be processed. We led to a lot of eggs. We lost a lot of vegetables. We've seen a lot of associated food waste to the pandemic because the food system supply chains just could not operate under those stresses. So having sort of framed that, we've got to look at really where these challenges remain. How do we feed 10 billion people by 2050? This is a requirement of 56% more food by 2050. This is a huge challenge that we've all got to rise to. We have to look at land. We mustn't be using more land. We've got to increase productivity. We've got to increase agroforestry systems. There's a lot of issues here around the environment. We've got to lower our emissions. We've got to look at how we reduce our emissions around the agriculture, the agribusiness, the food space. We've got to look at how we change our food systems, how we really change our approach to livestock management, how those animals are fed, what kind of systems. We've got to look at a lot more nutrition, proteins coming from plant-based systems, and we've got to look for a lot more resilience in the kind of crops that we grow. So while we're looking at all of this, we've got to make sure we reduce those emissions and we are lifting the people out of extreme poverty. So we've got to develop a food system that really works globally. So what we're looking at the World Bank is 10 critical but multi-sectorial transitions that are needed really to transform the food system. And this is back into this area that we look at: healthy planet, healthy people, healthy economy. I'm not going to go through this all, point by point on the slides. They're here for you to see. We've got to end up with healthy diets, which are affordable and nutritious to the global population. We have to stress, and I think Sahel is seeing this as well, and all the work we're doing, we're creating business opportunities within these sectors. It's not doom and gloom. It's how we come out building back better for this other side. We have to look at investment. We've got to look at where money is going. Where is public money going? Where is private money going? And we have to look at really where's the economic prize of moving away from these hidden costs that I've talked about within the food system. So looking at this, and we're coming towards the the last parts of this presentation, I really wanted to stress to you here, what the World Bank is trying to do is to repurpose where there is a lot of public support. Public support is positive and negative. What's positive about public support? It's about developing strong assets that can help communities develop. Strong approaches to food systems, strong approaches to health systems, education systems, and so on. So we have to look here at how, quite frankly, the governments crowd in and bring in the trillions of dollars of potential private sector investment. This is really critical on our approach. Now, we call this maximizing finance for development. The World Bank, I can say we're only putting in around about $4 billion a year into this $500 billion system. If $4 billion sounds a lot of money, and we're one of the largest banks and supporters to this whole global picture, our $20 billion portfolio is much smaller than where the public opportunity is. So the crowding into the private sector is vitally important. I think this slide really shows people, in the 2015 to 2017, where was public money going? Public money was going into market price support, 52%, into production payments to farmers of 22%, input subsidies, 10%, public goods, 16%, of only 1% was going into environmental investments, changing systems. When I look at that, I would seriously question my government. I would say to my government, what are you doing here? Where are you thinking of changing? Where are you thinking of investing for the future? What are you changing? $570 billion a year across the world is going into this area. Now, it's not up to me to judge which is right and which is wrong, but it's up to us to challenge, is 84% of this money, which is going into direct or indirect subsidies, is this money well spent? Is this money really moving people away from poverty? I had a very, very depressing conversation last week with the World Food Programme. They've been honored to receive this prize for the strong work they've done in global peace. Food insecurity and global peace are directly associated. And one of the directors I chose he turned around to me and said, the most depressing thing that they face is that they work with the same clients every year. I mean, what does that mean? The same clients every year? It's meaning that there's a whole segment of several millions of people. We had about extreme poverty of about 75 to 80 million people. This number is going up because of COVID. Their client base is growing because of COVID and other concerns like the locusts and climate change and drought, war, conflict, and so on. But this group, there's a core group that is stuck within that mechanism. That is something we all have to work to change. Looking forward here, really, we have to turn around as a global society. And I'm hoping that many people connected here are inspired. You're the entrepreneurs. You're the people that are really going to change the system. We have to look at innovation. We have to look at technology. The World Bank's been looking, at ICT platforms. We've been looking at digital solutions. We've been looking at precision farming. We've been looking at market access. We've been looking at, big data, the agricultural observatories, looking at weather data, connecting, data, information, giving not just governments or private sector, but smallholders, which is so important to us. the small, medium enterprises, which are so important to us, giving them ideas on how to work, supporting them, backing them, looking at how do we engage youth in a lot of these technology areas. Why youth might not be interested so much in the agricultural production space, they are very interested in the agricultural services space, the growing logistics, the importance of how we can bring more competitiveness, more innovation across these systems, how we can build smallholders into viable small, medium enterprises, get them to have investments in productive assets, warehousing, cold chain, and so on, and how they have official agreements that the way they link, to the off-takers, to the food systems, to the buyers, to the processors, and so on. There's a tremendous amount to be done in this space. So really, this is my closing slide, and I'm looking forward to having a dialogue now and obviously answering any questions. This is the start of a journey with you guys. I'm happy to work and support, but also, let's keep information and documents, flowing as we go forward. I'll stop sharing my screen now. I mean, it's great to see you again, Mezu. So I hope that sort of framed quite a lot of those areas. I hope that my technology worked and that you heard it all. I didn't break up. So back to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for, I think this is really a call to action. And you've touched on quite a few points. You talked about the hidden cost of the food system, 12 trillion odd, which many people really don't think about in terms of the impact on environment and health and other aspects. I think also the importance to think about food holistically, both on people's lives, the economy, a real broad-based engagement. And thank you for that. And of course, engaging the youth. I think to kick us off on a couple questions. I mean, the global food industry is roughly $8 trillion. Every year a large amount is invested into this space. A couple of years ago, in 2016, I believe it was about $420 million in capital went into food and agriculture. Of this, 23 billion, just a small drop, was directed at food and agriculture in Africa. Now, what in your view can be done from a policy perspective by various African countries and Nigeria in particular to attract more capital to the agriculture sector and to drive transformation?
I mean, this is the question that we look at day in, day out. I mean, there is so much that could be done. I think what's important just to acknowledge, I mean, that the World Bank is now being directed to push about 50 to 60% of its financial allocations into Africa. We see Africa as the most important area to actually support and invest in. The first thing I would say, Africa has huge opportunity. It's not as though the opportunities aren't there. I think, there is tremendous amount of issues around the governance of the sector. When we work with governments, I mean, we are looking at their policies. I mean, I encourage people to look at a report that we issue every 2 years called the Enabling the Business of Agriculture, EBA, Enabling the Business of Agriculture. It has its own website. You can look that up. You can actually profile specific countries. And we benchmark countries, through a very, very strong and robust methodology, looking at how government's policies are on inputs, policies on trade, policies on finance. And these are the areas that we use to create dialogue with countries. And one of the first concerns is, and I feel this very personally, I remember coming to Africa, into Nigeria in 1983. So you can tell that I'm getting very old. I'm not weary, but I'm getting old. And in 1983, I actually started working on land issues in Nigeria. And I think what's really sad, that over all my career, land issues is still a red hot topic across the world. We struggle on developing land as an asset class. If land was an asset class, like it is in many emerged economies, people could leverage finance against that asset. And I think that's one clear message that we constantly look at. Customary rights, which we respect, is very important because it gives stability of people to produce, but it doesn't give people the opportunity for using that land as a collateral. The other thing is that the governments are often swinging in their policies, particularly when it comes to import duties and so on. A lot of people who want to invest in developing certain businesses, like rice, for example, in Nigeria, the government has a very, very strong import duty on rice. Now, then those import duties can go up and down. They affect a lot of people's business decisions. So when it comes to the trade areas, people need continuity. They need to understand really clearly where those governments are focused on their policies, and those policies are consistent. The other thing that we've been asked to work on very strongly, and I think it's an agenda that Nigeria actually did some very good work on, was the issues around state-owned enterprises, SOEs as we call them. They're still very dominant in many African countries. You can argue, are they competitive or are they uncompetitive? Do they crowd out the private sector? Nigeria did a very, very strong agenda of privatization back in the 90s, where a lot of state-owned enterprises were privatized. And a lot of those businesses gave the opportunity for more investment and the private sector to flourish, particularly around a lot of essential services like vegetable oils, around the cotton businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So those things are very important. But also the real thrust that we struggle with is really getting engagement of commercial finance into the agribusiness agenda. Agriculture, I'm going to turn around and say, is considered to be a massive high risk. There are many lenders that avoid and they don't engage in lending into agricultural production. They're more likely to lend into supply chain finance, short-term procurement finance, or maybe into the assets, as you know very well, in building assets. But actually getting funding for a lot of agricultural production systems can be hard. There's a very, very high transaction cost of working to smallholders or SMEs. And this is where we are looking very strongly. How do we use the technology to link smallholders and SMEs? How do we build financial instruments and packages to enable finance and to de-risk finance? Interest rates are very high to a lot of producers, particularly in local currencies. But what we are stressing to banks, and we're trying to work with them at the World Bank end, I mean, we're doing a lot of work on de-risking, working with banks in Pacific countries. We're trying to strengthen their agricultural portfolio. We're trying to strengthen them for the opportunities of on lending to the SME sector. A lot of the IFC's work has been working on strengthening banks' portfolio, helping them build a pipeline, checking and supporting business plan development of SMEs. And at the same time, the World Bank itself has been looking at blended finance models, first loss, and so on, with the objective, if you look at it from a business where we're trying to strengthen the back end of the bank so that it can do its business at the front end. And back end strengthening means that we can help that bank to reduce its transaction costs so it doesn't put an excessive amount of interest rate onto those banks. The other thing, of course, is that technologies is not just about the technology we consider through the smartphone, the technology we consider linking to finance, but technology is about improved seed varieties, more use of water, real clever use of water. We call it more crop but drop. Looking really at really important irrigation systems, where we're not looking at flood irrigation, we're not looking at sprinkler systems, we're looking a lot more at the precision irrigation models. So really trying to up the investments and commercialize agriculture. The other area that I think really does come to your question well, we can say we've got about 500 million smallholders across the world. We did a sort of a dipstick type survey, not really a robust survey, but from that, I can say around about 11% of that 500 million are integrated into value chains. And if you say, what does that 11% mean? That means that they're connected to an off-taker, are formally connected in some sort of mechanism that when they come to produce a crop, their market is there. So we've got 89% of farmers who produce for what? They produce for the market. We've seen an awful lot of markets where there is an overproduction in tomato. There's an overproduction in certain crops that get a high level of waste because they're not connected through their logistics and supply chains to the markets. So we're trying to strengthen that integration. And as we go forward, I can give you some thoughts really about where we're seeing new innovation
Sure.
ideas. But back to you.
Sure. And I think the couple comments you made that were very personal for me was the intersection between land-related issues and financing. Because of course, if farmers can't use their land as collateral, they can get appropriate financing. And at the same time, it also reduces the incentive to invest in the farmland as infrastructure, over the long term. Now, going to another question, the agriculture sector worldwide going through huge amount of transformation. You've touched on your earlier presentation about how we need to farm more with less resources effectively to ensure sustainability. And this climate change, the world population is growing rapidly, and a huge amount of that growth is going to come from Africa. And I think for that reason, many African countries are talking about self-sufficiency around growing food, and just to ensure that there is food security. Now, what is your views around this in terms of, should it matter where food is produced, whether it's imported and grown elsewhere or grown locally? And how should we think about these issues, imported food versus grown locally? And assuming that you lie on the side of, do more closer to home, and what steps can African countries take to meet some of this expected food demand growth?
Well, that is the big subject, and I thank you for that question. Population growth in Africa is projected to go up by 1 billion by 2050. Where is the population growth? When we go from 7 billion to 9, 10 billion, the population growth is going to be in Asia, at least 1 billion more people, and 1 billion people in Africa. And I think the saddest thing that if we overlay what is happening in those geographical spaces, number one to me is water stress. Where is this water? I think number two that I would overlay to that is the climate change risk in those spaces. And number three is conflict. As we go forward in conflict, this FCV, fragile conflict states, is a huge concern to the global community. It's a huge concern to the World Bank. So as we move to any form of self-sufficiency, number one, there has to be peace and security to bring in investment. This is not just outside investment, this is also local investment. I mean, sometimes people say to me, hey, Chris, would you put your money in Nigeria? You know the country well. I mean, some of that would say, well, maybe selectively in certain parts, but not others. There's parts in the Northeast that I'd be very worried about. There's parts across the northern parts of Nigeria be worried about the climate change conversation. So we have to look at this. So when it comes to number one, governments have a responsibility to their citizens in terms of food security. So it should be number one on the government's radar. I think very depressingly, when you analyze government's numbers in terms of where do they invest a lot of money in other service sectors, obviously very warranted in health and education, but there's far too much money going into security and all these other kind of things, which of course the government will argue they need, but if the money is going there, maybe it's not going into the agricultural or food development space. I think underlying a lot of the issues that you're talking about here, this question, is the complete lack of investment in research and development. Some numbers that came out very recently, that if you look at the amount of money that's spent in research and development in Africa, obviously it's very low, but the private sector takes on about 85 to 90% of research and development investments in emerging economies, where the private sector only invests about 10% into emerging economies. So this is something that we've got to engage more. We've got to have a lot more engagement in research and development. There are many commodities and crops which are receiving very, very little research. Cocoa, coffee, a lot of crops which are inherently produced in Africa, cotton varieties and so on, aren't suitable. There is also, we're talking about scaling up investments in technology. We have a lot to do in that space. So I'm going to turn around to you and say that I'm a global value chains person. I firmly believe that a country should look at food security. It should look at what it can grow competitively for its domestic markets and international markets, domestic markets being the priority. If it can export competitively and profitably, then of course it can go onto international markets and buy foods and grains. When we look at the staples like your wheats and barleys, there's 4 or 5 countries in the world that produce about 85% of those crops. They are completely commercial, they're completely large scale, they're very competitive. You know, we get countries saying, well, it's better to go onto the market, the international market, and buy so-and-so crop because it's a challenge to grow it at home. And we could release that land for growing crops which are more viable. That takes a lot of maturity, it takes a lot of planning, it takes a lot of structural agreement across the country. But these are where a lot of countries head. For example, China was producing soybean. Why was it producing soybean? Because it's the largest pork producer in the world, and they need a largest pork consumer in the world. They need a huge amount of soybean for that industry. Within 2 years, they transformed out of growing soybean for the simple reason that soybean consumes quite a lot of water. They wanted that water for their urban development as well as a higher value agricultural production. So they decided, well, it's better to go to Brazil and buy soybean and do firm contracts with soybean, even the US, and import that product. So really, in effect, I mean, water drove that decision. It wasn't about the crop, it was about the resource. And I think when it comes to a lot of areas in Africa, there are a lot of areas that, number one, have huge opportunity of increasing productivity. They have huge opportunities of reducing food loss and waste. There's a lot of opportunities in producing a lot better fortified products to reduce stunting, to reduce these micronutrient deficiencies within, you know, staple crops as well as the vegetable crops. But governments need to invest and develop models in the agro-logistics. We are saying to people, and you know, a lot of governments, you know, I'm trying to keep your real, you know, your conversation, you know, your question in my mind, but it raises a lot of bigger pictures. If you looked at emerging economies, there are 10 jobs across the agribusiness value chain, from production all the way through to the consumer. This is going from the production, you know, the input markets, the value, you know, the logistics, the processing, the actual marketing, you know, the distribution, the retail. There is 1 job in production, there is 9 jobs off the production, off the farm. Whereas in a lot of the Africa context, there are lots of jobs on the farm and less jobs outside of the off-farm space. So this tells me we have a lot of transformation, we need a lot of investment, we need a lot of support to commercialize and strengthen those systems to supply the domestic markets. When you talk about Nigeria, I think a lot of things which are a bit worrying in Nigeria is that it's cheaper for a lot of companies to import products into Lagos and supply that market than transport products from the north all the way down. The cost of transport, the cost of logistics, the inefficiency is high. I think one of the saddest contributions that I remember, we were in a conversation with the World Resources Institute, WRI, which look at a lot of these global value chains. They look at deforestation, they look at data and so on. They said on their recent analysis of food loss and waste, if they put the food loss and waste in the context of agricultural production, then it would be the equivalent of the total production in China is what is wasted. So if we could fix the food loss and waste problem, which is very high in Africa, on-farm and off-farm waste, that would transform a lot of the numbers towards food security. So I hope that sort of frames it. I mean, it's very hard to say each country should ring fence itself, but at the same time, we are part of a global system. Okay.
And I hear very clearly the free trade views coming through, and the importance of doing what you can do competitively, and then thinking strategically around overall agricultural strategy, such as the example you gave with China and soybeans. And, because most people think if I'm the biggest pork producer, then let me also grow the soybeans versus if somebody else can do it better. And I've just got to notice that just to manage the overall time of the conference, we'll be finishing in 10 minutes at 3:30. There's a ton of questions from the audience. So I'm going to segue into those questions now. And interestingly, a couple of them have to do with free trade related. And in particular, a few questions are around the Africa Free Trade Agreement that's being put into place. And just to get your views around synchronization of policies across the continent. How does food security become a continental objective? Views around harmonization of tariffs, and how both, I guess, private sector and public sector should think about this. And I'm combining a few questions around free trade into this one.
Okay, so we got one day to talk about this, or just a few minutes? I mean, this is the big conversation.
Well, I want to try. I know we don't have time.
Okay.
I want to try with at least two questions. So maybe a 3-4 minutes.
Sure. I mean, obviously a great question. I mean, at the World Bank, we are very much in promoting regional trade dialogue, regional tariffs, etc. I think the ECOWAS community has huge opportunities for cross-border trade. There's a lot of opportunities of moving rice across those borders. There's a lot of rice being produced in certain parts of West Africa, which is not being moved around well. We often talk about the rice factor when it comes to Nigeria. There's a lot of opportunities to produce rice in Nigeria. And there's a lot of opportunities for Nigeria, not just to produce the right quality for the market, but also to look at bringing in rice across the regional trade areas. There's a lot of issues around moving maize around the regions. We see this a lot, of course, in the East Africa context as well. Like Zambia is exporting maize to Zimbabwe and so on. But you're completely right. I would like to see, and I can be bold at this, I'm a very neutral citizen being in the World Bank. I'd like to see a much more joined up ECOWAS. I think ECOWAS can bring so much more in terms of really harmonizing, not just regional, not just tariffs, but also, food safety standards, food quality standards, all of these kind of areas that need to be looked at. We need to encourage a level business playing field. Many countries are offering incentives for the private sector to come to. We can be talking about incentives, in terms of tax breaks and so on and so forth. We need to be looking at how those incentives can either help the right investment or can distort the wrong investment. So as a very, very quick summary, to your answer, regional trade is very much on our radar. I would be looking forward to be working at, a much higher level area of governance. When we talk about the government, I think it's very, very relevant. There is a lot of complexity in talking to the government. Nigeria, we talk to the federal government. In Nigeria, we talk to state governments, and we do a lot of lending at state government level. But the other complexity is that very often when we talk about agriculture can be under the Ministry of Agriculture, but agricultural processing would be under ministries of trade, Ministry of Investments, different ministries. So there's a lot of complexity on how we work with governments. And environment can be outside of that space, water can be outside of that space. So we have a lot to do on regional standards with certain bodies within those governments. I hope that gives a quick reply. I'm keeping my eye on the time as well.
Sure. And you made a comment about level playing field and ensuring policies enable that. And which takes me to another question I saw, where individuals mentioning that quite often either policies favor the larger players, or you have the capital that's available going to the larger, more established players. And these SMEs, smaller players, farmers, really have a harder time either accessing financing or competing in the environment due to an uneven playing field in different markets. And so, do you have specific views that could enable, policy development or enable, individual private sector players to think about this in a certain way? And I'm sure this is a tough question as well, because ultimately, policymakers should ensure there's a level playing field. But unfortunately, we are in the reality of our markets. But if you could touch a little bit about that, just in terms of either initiatives or policies that can be done to enable that playing field, or on the other hand, if there are steps you see, certain governments taking already to enable that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very big topic again. I mean, I think this is an area just to sort of evidence. I mean, the World Bank's beneficiaries, we focus on smallholder and SME development. That is clearly our focus. We want to build viable enterprises that can move up from not just being small but to medium and then grow and develop. It's tremendously complex to work with a fragmented system. We are working very hard at building viable cooperatives, viable producer associations. We're looking at working with governments on really how do we develop these policies to enable these smallholders to come together into, community associations. And then at the World Bank, we very much focus on what we call our productive alliance model. What is productive alliances? This is where we work with private sector being the smallholder SME. And what we do is we give them matching grants to build assets for their farming systems. This could be on warehousing, it could be on developing mechanization strategies and so on. So we give matching grants so that they can leverage finance, for that system. So this is really sort of giving them a leg up, to get them going on commercialization. The other area that I think when it comes to policy, which is exceptionally weak in Africa, is the concept of contract farming. We would like to see, proper contracts being put in place between producers or SMEs to off-takers, the traders or the processors. Those contracts then can be turned into financial instruments, that we can help to support and finance those instruments. At the moment, these agreements aren't contracts. They are very, very weak agreements that some banks aren't even looking at. And I'm going to get even a little bit more depressing for you and say that in the last month, we've actually noticed a lot of private capital moving away from the agribusiness sector. This is due to the risk, not just climate change risk, but volatility of commodities. And we are negotiating very heavily with large commercial banks to make sure that we can bring them back and hold them in the sector. So this whole agribusiness forestry sector is seeing a reduction in the availability of private capital. And that is concerning. Even large-scale multinationals are seeing their cost of borrowing going up in this space. So I really want to reflect that there is a global crisis around this area, and the World Bank is trying to work out how we can de-risk and strengthen government policies on this. The other thing, just to sort of add to you, is we have to have more and more local value addition on these commodities. We should be building much more local processing. It doesn't have to be complicated processing, but value addition when it comes to maize, when it comes to all of the staples, rice and so on. So they go into domestic markets with a value addition back to the producer.
Yeah. And the comment you made about, providers of finance being worried about the agricultural sector, I always find fascinating. And, when I've heard that from a couple of banks in Nigeria, I've always asked them, your greatest non-performing loans, which sector are they in? And, it's the oil and gas sector.
Yeah.
So, it's really a question of, how do you, every sector has its risks, and then how do you actually mitigate those particular risks? But I do agree, it's there's quite a bit of concern around the sector. One more question, and then we will wrap up. And it's a question from an individual who, I guess is recognizing there are differences, within the continent. There are fragile states and then more developed markets. And, security constraints, even more of a bigger issue in those, fragile state countries, less so in others. And how should do you have any particular recommendations for fragile states, however you define them to be in terms of how to address specific policy or attract capital or who to partner with? And just a few minutes around that, and then we can wrap.
Well, I'm very thankful to get that question because I personally lived 4 years in Afghanistan, working on very strong rural agricultural development, trying to build viable food supply systems within fragile conflict states. I find it a bit of a difficult conversation because, we're seeing more and more FCVs, not less. There is more migrants today than there was at the end of the Second World War. So you can actually turn around and say, what society are we building? The crisis in Afghanistan, as an example, has got even worse with the COVID crisis. The government's finding it very, very hard to service its people. The food insecurity systems are getting stronger and stronger. The World Bank looks at various financing and models. We set up trust funds. So we have the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund that we manage, and we invest that money in developing community-based agricultural systems. They can be value chain focused, where we add, the logistics, we build the markets, we support the trade, and so on. This is all part of that heavy lifting approach. We have a very, very important program called GAFSP. This is the Global Food Security Program, GAFSP. I'd advise your listeners or our audience to actually look at the website for GAFSP. This is a very, very important trust fund that the World Bank manages. It's got a public sector window and a private sector window, as well as the work it does engaging communities. We actually target supporting private sector businesses in fragile conflict violent FCVs, fragile conflict violent states. A very, very important, financial mechanism that we work with. But obviously in these areas, the governments are incredibly weak in their fiscal management to support these countries. So the other area we're looking at, we can argue where we've been successful in producing a lot of agricultural products in fragile conflict violent states. We follow the agri-park model, where we start to build agricultural parks so that agribusinesses can be set up in a safe, secure environment with guaranteed power, security, water, and so on, so that they can build agricultural processing businesses to supply domestic markets and international markets as well. So there is a lot of instruments around this, but the whole package is difficult. I mean, my heart goes out to northeast Nigeria and then Cameroon-Chad border, where I lived for about 7 years, where in Adamawa State, I know that they're struggling. There's a lot of issues there as well. So these are the countries and areas that the bank has special funding facilities for to support those developments. Now back to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chris. So we've just had a session with Chris Brett, the lead agri-business specialist with the World Bank. Thank you very much for your insights and your time. And for everyone participating, thank you as well. And we'll all be heading back to the main stage for the continuation of the conference. So thank you very much. And we look forward to continuing to engage with you over the next couple of hours of the conference. Thank you and have a good day. Thank you again, Chris.
Thank you very much. Very enjoyable. Thank you.